I'm going to just briefly try to introduce the topic at hand. I've called this presentation Unmixing Structure and Presentation. And I think it's kind of like the web field has this discussion that it keeps coming back to about how do we reason about presentation and how do we reason about structure, both in the presentational formats that we choose and in our tooling and how we sort of think about these things. And I thought it would be good to go a little bit back in time and sort of look at sort of different renegotiations of how the field has looked at these things at different points in time and have tried to sort of define best practice. And I think it's good to look at that now because I think that like there's this huge shift in how this is playing out now. So if we start with a really big view, then whenever we want to write things down, we first need to create writing systems in order to do so, to have any sort of hope of transferring meaning to anyone. And these systems are kind of almost arbitrary as long as we manage to agree upon how they work. They can be pictures of the ideas that we have inside our minds, or they can be little symbols that represent how our mouths move, and it's really arbitrary. And then we spend a lot of time installing these things inside the heads of our sort of kids, and that's how these things work. And the interesting, or the good thing at least about these things, even though they're kind of unwieldy to work with as a culture, is that they are direct in how they transmit information. Those semioticians might not agree with that. Is at least that you can use these rules to write things down on some medium, someone can look at it and meaning happens inside of their heads. All of this gets worse a few thousand years later when these things show up. Word processors, and this is an IBM machine from the 60s. So then kind of like the transferal of meaning is augmented through different systems. So there's I express my intention through some mechanism, it's recorded, and then there's presentation, right? And then this thing happens where we start thinking about how could we shape the recording to sort of give us optimal flexibility when we try to present it to someone, and what's the best negotiation between constraints of these things. And then you get things like this, right? This is from the 1960s. You get things like SGML. SGML is kind of like awesome structured content, right? It was used extensively by the U.S. military, amongst other organizations. And the only rules that structured generalized markup language really has is that it needs to describe a document structure, and then it needs to make it available for rigorous processing by programs and databases. And that's an excellent requirement for a document format still to this day. And kind of luckily, SGML was adopted by Tim Berners-Lee, so this thinking made its way into HTML. So in early days here, you had this prerogative of making these web pages sort of available for this kind of machinic transformation. And I think in 1990, it must have felt kind of perfect because suddenly you had outlining and hyperlinks, and it solved a lot of non-trivial problems. And Tim probably hand-coded his HTML and built it as static sites and FTP'd it by hand to his servers. Everything was pretty nice. And then, I don't know how many of you know about this book. It showed up in 1996. And it was a book that basically told you how to break the web. It showed you how to sort of because there wasn't a real way at that point to style these pages. So the only way to do it was to abuse the markup language, to put style inside of the page. And in 1997, Siegel described it like this himself. David Siegel is the guy who wrote the book. The hacks I've espoused, especially the single pixel GIF, and using frames and tables to do layout, are the duct tape of the web. I ruined the web by mixing chocolate and peanut butter so that they could never be unmixed. I committed the hangable offense of mixing structure with presentation. See here how he's trying to make himself grand by making himself the supervillain of this structured content narrative. I think is really good. And then 2001 rolls sort of round. Web standards try to set this straight. And the web standards argument was really it was super multifaceted because it was both about craft, use value, findability, searchability, and it was also about ethics, the ethics of universal access, that the web should be available to anyone, so we should build with these tools in a good way. But at its core, though, the Web Standards Project was also an argument about why structure and presentation should remain unmixed, so that machines could both better parse and represent these documents. So, and then kind of like, I wouldn't say that it was solved, but at least someone managed to negotiate something that felt like it was working at that point, over in this end. So we at least now knew how to present these documents to users. But over on the left-hand side here, sort of like what do you store this content as? It's kind of like nothing was ever solved, right? Because what was happening there? Well, people were flat files, HTML, they were making databases that they put HTML into. They wrote things in Markdown. Markdown has loads of HTML. You could do whatever you sort of liked, and these systems were very pragmatic, and they were doing their best, right? So it was probably the best solution you had at any given time. But even though some people might have thought that the chocolate and the peanut butter had been separated on the right-hand side, the same story wasn't on the left-hand side. Yeah, so databases, and then sort of like the seemingly most beautiful solutions here were things like the Semantic Web. And they were like these beautiful, almost transcendental ideas about how you could get the peanut butter and the chocolate away from each other forever. And never shall they meet, right? And it was this idea that you could have information that was almost pure and meaningful, not in any kind of sort of context. And in retrospect, this might seem kind of utopian. The syntax of these things was very precise, but it was surprisingly vague exactly how things would work out in practice. This is a great story from, this is an interview with Tim Berners-Lee, and it reads almost like a cyberpunk novel. And this is kind of like this is the experience of what Web 3.0 was going to be like. And Web 3.0 was going to be on top of Web 2.0. And it was everything rippling and folding and looking misty. And that's beautiful. And it's almost like something out of William Gibson. It's almost like the Matrix. But this didn't happen, right? So RDF didn't happen. So I think the problem at the core of RDF is something that we might call the abstraction fallacy. Because when you have the experience of making a messy model a little bit cleaner, it increases utility radically. And therefore, by extension, you start to think that an infinitely pure model must therefore be infinitely usable. And then you start thinking about these Byzantine systems that you can sort of have this purity captured in. But as you kind of find out, all optimal representations are pragmatic, and they're only useful for very specific sets of situations. And that's what people were doing when they were putting HTML inside their databases. They were making pragmatic choices about how to store stuff. So I think this sort of, what changes here and what has to change are these external circumstances. So a few years go by, and then 2010 happens, and there's like this three-dimensional explosion in complexity. And the explosion in complexity is both one, from the phones showing up and the devices, and Corning shipping like billions of square feet of glass for LCD screens. It's about APIs, and it's about the front-end frameworks that people can now use and that people love, and that let them build better and faster things. And none of these things want data that isn't structured, right? All of these things really want structured data. And then, the underlying reality changes, and then the representational formats that we are willing to expect actually change. Yeah, so this starts to sort of happen. And then you get this in sort of response. You start to see people use graph databases and content APIs. You start to see JSON and GraphQL for the transmission layer, and then you start to see like a million things that this can be poured into and changed into. So I think this is a large sort of shift that's happening, and it's something that affects what we do and a lot of the companies that we work with, and it's also changing how sort of web practitioners reason about how they build things. And characteristically, as far as I can tell, we're in the middle of this right now. And then very often people will have coined this term, and there'll be an ISO committee or a W3C committee trying to figure out the details. But kind of like with web standards, it feels to me like like this is up to people like us, because it's all done in a very pragmatic sense. We're all just trying to figure out how to get most value out of spending a little more time on using structured data instead of loosely structured things. So treating content as structured data is really starting to make sense, and I think it's up to us as a community to figure out how to best do this. So we thought it would make sense to talk to you about ways to best track these developments and figure out how we should keep our structure and our presentation as separate things. And thank you.